My wife cancelled our 15th anniversary dinner for a client emergency, but her own calendar already had our reservation written in hours before she ever called me. Viewers, before you continue, please subscribe, like and share for more interesting stories. Joseph Eric, 42 years old, structural engineer, Nashville, Tennessee. 15 years married to Jenny Joseph, the woman I met in a college library during a thunderstorm, the woman I built an entire life around the way I build bridges, one calculated beam at a time, trusting the math because the math had never once lied to me. We had 2 kids, a house near Green Hills, and a marriage I would have sworn, under oath, was solid. That certainty ended on a Tuesday afternoon, on our 15th anniversary, at 4:47 p.m., when my phone lit up with her name. "Babe, I'm so sorry," Jenny said, breathless, the sound of an office behind her, or something that sounded like one. "Client emergency just landed on my desk. I'll be stuck here till at least 10. I told her it was fine, that these things happen, that I understood, even as something cold moved through my chest, quiet and unfamiliar, like the first hairline crack in a support beam that hasn't failed yet but never fully heals either. What she didn't know was that I had spent 3 months planning tonight in secret, a reservation at Bella Notte, the new Italian place downtown, a violinist paid in advance, a ring box with a new pair of earrings tucked into my jacket pocket. I told myself I'd surprise her anyway. Maybe she'd finish early. Maybe I'd walk in and find her exhausted at her desk and bring dinner to her instead. Then I saw it. Our shared iPad, still open on the kitchen counter, her calendar app glowing in the dim evening light. Right there, under tonight's date, in her own handwriting synced from her phone, anniversary, Bella Notte, 7:30. My own reservation. My own restaurant. Written in her calendar hours before she ever called to cancel on me. I stood there in that kitchen for a long moment, staring at words that shouldn't have existed, feeling the floor tilt slightly beneath a marriage I thought I understood better than anyone. I told myself there had to be an explanation. I told myself I was overreacting. But some part of me, the engineer in me, already knew, when you find a crack you didn't expect, you don't ignore it. You go find out how deep it runs. I didn't call her back. I didn't accuse her over the phone the way a weaker version of myself might have wanted to. Instead, I told myself I needed to see with my own eyes before I let myself believe anything. I put on the navy suit I'd picked out for tonight, adjusted my tie in the hallway mirror, and noticed my hands were trembling slightly, a tremor I hadn't felt since the day my father died 3 years earlier, a grief I buried by working 80-hour weeks instead of grieving properly, something Jenny had mentioned more than once in passing, something I had brushed off as nagging instead of a warning. Bella Notte had been recommended to me months ago by my business partner Anthony, who described it as new, quiet, off the radar, the kind of place people go when they don't want to be seen. At the time I thought that was a selling point for a romantic anniversary. Now, driving through the rain-slicked streets of downtown Nashville, the phrase replayed in my head with a different weight entirely. Off the radar. Who else had Anthony recommended this place to? I parked 2 rows back from the entrance, engine still running, watching the golden light spill out of the restaurant's windows onto the wet pavement. I told myself I would just look. Confirm there was nothing. Drive home embarrassed at my own paranoia and never speak of it again. But as I stepped out of my car, my phone buzzed with a text from my business partner, unrelated, about a permit filing, and I remembered something I hadn't thought about in months. Richard, the silent investor behind half our firm's biggest contracts, a man I'd only shaken hands with twice, had also been introduced to me by Anthony, around the same time as this restaurant. I told myself it meant nothing. Coincidences exist. Nashville isn't that big of a city, and downtown restaurant recommendations circulate among the same tight circles of professionals. But some part of me, the part that spends its days calculating load limits and failure points, was already building a structure out of these details, one I didn't want to see completed. I walked toward the entrance anyway, because some cracks you can't unsee once you've noticed them, you can only follow them to their source. The hostess seated me in a corner booth near the back without me even asking, and it wasn't until I sat down that I realized why. The entire restaurant was visible from that angle, every table lit in warm amber light, servers moving between them like they were choreographed. I ordered a glass of scotch I had no intention of drinking and scanned the room slowly, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that Jenny was probably still at her office 3 miles away drowning in spreadsheets. Then I saw her. Jenny, in the red dress I had bought her for her 38th birthday, sitting at a table near the window, laughing in a way I hadn't seen in months, maybe longer. Across from her sat a man in a navy blazer, broad-shouldered, comfortable, leaning in like he belonged there. My stomach dropped in a way I can only describe as physical, a sudden absence of gravity, like missing a stair in the dark. I told myself there could be an explanation. A colleague. A client dinner she forgot to mention. But the way she touched her hair, the way she tilted her head when she laughed, the ease in her shoulders, none of it looked like business. It looked like comfort. It looked like familiarity built over time, not over one dinner. I remembered buying that dress for her birthday, remembered how she'd twirled in it in our bedroom, how I'd told her she looked like the day I met her in that college library during a thunderstorm 15 years ago. She was wearing that same dress for someone else tonight, on our anniversary, in the restaurant I had booked in secret. The man reached across the table and touched her hand, lightly, casually, the way you touch someone you've touched 100 times before. I couldn't see his face clearly from this angle, but something about him tugged at a memory I couldn't place yet, a rose gold watch catching the restaurant light, cracked slightly at the face, the kind of detail you'd only notice if you'd seen it before somewhere else, somewhere unexpected, somewhere that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with my career. The watch. I stared at it from across the room, my scotch untouched, my pulse loud in my own ears. A rose gold Tag Heuer, cracked at the face, worn slightly loose on his wrist the way expensive watches are worn by people who've owned them long enough to stop noticing the weight. I had seen that exact watch before. Not recently. At a groundbreaking ceremony 18 months ago, on the wrist of Richard Callaway, the silent investor behind nearly half of my engineering firm's largest contracts, a man whose signature appeared on paperwork I signed without ever really getting to know him personally. My mind moved fast, assembling fragments I hadn't thought to connect until this exact moment. Richard had been introduced to me by Anthony. Anthony had recommended this restaurant. Jenny had mentioned, almost 6 months ago, that she was doing joint marketing work out of Richard's office building for a campaign I never asked enough questions about because I trusted her completely, because 15 years of marriage teaches you to stop double-checking the people you love. I sat there running numbers I didn't want to calculate. If that man was Richard, then this wasn't just my wife having an affair. This was my wife having an affair with the man who held financial leverage over my company's future, the man whose money kept our firm's biggest projects funded, whose goodwill I depended on every time I needed capital for equipment or payroll during slow seasons. I thought about the flashback that surfaced uninvited, Richard shaking my hand firmly at that groundbreaking ceremony, sunlight catching the same cracked watch face, his voice saying something forgettable about partnership and trust while my wife stood somewhere nearby making small talk with the other investors' spouses. Had it already started then? Had she been standing in that same room, laughing at his jokes, while I was busy shaking hands and believing everyone in that circle wished me well? I didn't move from my booth. I didn't approach their table. I sat with my scotch melting into water and watched my 15-year marriage rearrange itself into something unrecognizable, one cracked watch face at a time, understanding that whatever this was, it reached far beyond a hotel room or a stolen evening. It reached into my company, my livelihood, the foundation beneath everything I'd built. I didn't confront her. Not that night. Some cowardice in me, or maybe just engineering instinct, told me that confronting a structure before you understand its full failure point only gets you buried in the collapse. I needed to know how long this had been going on, how deep the crack ran before I decided how to respond to it. When they finally stood to leave, I gave them a 2-minute head start before following at a distance, staying 2 cars back through downtown Nashville's wet streets, my headlights off longer than they should have been, my hands sweating against the steering wheel despite the cold night air bleeding through the vents. Rain streaked sideways across my windshield, blurring their taillights into long red smears that I chased through intersections I'd driven 1,000 times before, never once imagining I'd be using this route to spy on my own wife. As I drove, a memory surfaced that I hadn't thought about in months. 6 years ago, Jenny had briefly started working from Richard's office building for a joint marketing campaign between our firm and his investment group, a temporary arrangement that lasted longer than the campaign itself ever needed. At the time I'd thought nothing of it. I was drowning in a major bridge retrofit project that consumed my evenings and weekends, grateful, honestly, that she had something professionally engaging to occupy her time while I disappeared into blueprints and site visits. I remembered her coming home later during that period, always with a reasonable explanation, always tired in a way that seemed earned rather than suspicious. I remembered thinking I was lucky to have a wife so independent, so capable of building her own professional world alongside mine. Now I wondered how much of that independence had simply been distance dressed up as ambition, how much of her tiredness had come from a life I knew nothing about. They didn't head toward a hotel, which somehow made everything worse. Hotels suggest something temporary, something contained. Instead, they turned into a quiet residential neighborhood I didn't recognize, tree-lined streets I'd never had reason to drive through, and pulled into the driveway of a modest brick house with a porch light already glowing amber through the rain, waiting for them like it had done this before. I parked across the street, 2 houses down, killing my headlights and letting the rain do the work of hiding me in plain sight. I watched Richard walk around to open Jenny's door, watched her step out laughing at something he said, watched them walk up the porch steps together with an ease that told me this wasn't a first visit. She reached into her purse and pulled out a key. Her own key. She didn't knock. She didn't wait to be let in. She let herself into a house I had never seen before, a house that apparently belonged, at least partially, to my own wife. Sitting there in the dark, engine off, rain drumming against my roof, I let a memory surface that I'd buried without realizing its significance. 2 years ago, Jenny's aunt had passed away and left her a modest inheritance, somewhere around $80,000, money that never touched our joint checking account, money she said she wanted to invest separately for the kids' future. At the time I'd respected that boundary, admired her financial independence, never once thought to ask where exactly that investment had gone. Looking at this house now, at the key she carried like it was hers, I understood with sickening clarity where at least part of that money might have landed. The porch light clicked off after a few minutes, leaving only a warm glow from what I guessed was the living room window, curtains drawn just enough to hide shapes but not enough to hide the fact that someone was moving around inside, comfortable, unhurried, at home. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, and for a moment I almost ignored it, assuming it was Anthony or a work notification. Instead it was a text from my 12-year-old daughter, Emma, sent from her mother's old tablet that she used for homework. "Dad, is Mom staying at Grandma's again tonight?" Again. I stared at that single word until the letters blurred slightly, rain and exhaustion and heartbreak conspiring to make it harder to read, though the meaning arrived clearly enough regardless. My daughter, 12 years old, had noticed a pattern in her mother's absences that I, her husband of 15 years, had somehow completely failed to see. I drove home in silence, windshield wipers beating steady rhythm against the rain, my daughter's text glowing on the dashboard mount where I'd propped my phone. Again. Not once. Not confused. Again, the casual certainty of a child who has simply accepted a recurring fact about her family's life without questioning it, because children absorb patterns long before adults are willing to admit they exist. I began replaying the last year of our marriage like a slideshow I'd never properly examined, images I'd filed away under busy or tired or normal marriage stress without ever asking harder questions. The nights Jenny came home after 10 claiming client dinners. The weekend trip to visit her mother, 3 states away that lasted 4 days instead of 2. The new perfume I'd noticed but never mentioned, floral and expensive, nothing like what she usually wore. Each memory arrived with a fresh sting, evidence I had walked past 100 times without recognizing it as evidence at all. Then I remembered something sharper, more damning. Jenny's mother, Carol, a woman I'd always respected, had covered for her on at least 3 occasions I could now recall with painful clarity, phone calls where Carol mentioned Jenny just stepping out for a bit when I called the house looking for her, vague explanations that I'd accepted at face value because why would my own mother-in-law lie to me? If Carol had known, even partially, and said nothing, then the circle of silence around my marriage's unraveling extended further than I wanted to comprehend, family included. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the rain had softened to a drizzle, and the house sat dark except for the porch light I'd left on before leaving. I sat in the car for a long moment, gathering whatever composure I had left, wiping at my eyes almost angrily, frustrated with myself for crying over a woman who was, at that exact moment, sitting in another man's living room like she belonged there. Inside, the house felt too quiet, too still, a stage set for a performance that hadn't started yet. And there, on the kitchen counter, glowing faintly in the dark, sat Jenny's laptop, open, unlocked, her email account still logged in from earlier that afternoon, as though the universe itself had decided I'd earned one more piece of the truth before the night was over. I stood over that laptop for a long moment before touching it, some old instinct about privacy still holding me back even after everything I'd already witnessed that night. But the cursor was already blinking in her inbox, and one subject line near the top caught my eye before I'd even decided to look: property transfer, final documents. I clicked it, and everything I thought I understood about my marriage rearranged itself again, this time into something far worse than infidelity alone. The email wasn't about Richard's romantic involvement with my wife. It was about money, specific dollar amounts, timestamps stretching back 18 months, wire transfers moving from our joint savings account into something called Hartwell Consulting, a shell business I had never heard of, registered under an address I now recognized as the brick house I'd been parked outside less than an hour earlier. I scrolled further, hands steady now in a way that surprised me, the engineer in me taking over where the husband had failed. Richard wasn't simply Jenny's affair. He was her business partner in a real estate flip, using capital quietly drained from accounts meant for our children's college funds, funneling it through consulting fees and property transfers designed to look legitimate to anyone who didn't know to look closely. I thought about every late night, every mysterious weekend trip, every uncomfortable conversation about keeping some financial independence that Jenny had framed as empowerment and I had accepted as reasonable. None of it had been about independence. It had been about building an entire second life, funded by money that belonged to our family, hidden behind spreadsheets and shell companies and a man whose watch I'd only recognized by accident. I forwarded every relevant email to my personal account, methodically, deliberately, documenting timestamps and figures with the same precision I'd bring to a structural failure report. My hands didn't shake anymore. Somewhere between the restaurant and this kitchen counter, shock had hardened into something colder and more useful. Headlights swept across the living room wall just as I finished the last forward, tires crunching against our wet driveway outside, Jenny finally coming home from a house that had never been part of any story she'd told me. I didn't close the laptop. I didn't hide what I'd found or rehearse a calm opening line. When Jenny walked through the door, keys jingling, red dress still slightly damp at the hem from the rain, I simply turned the screen toward her, the transaction history and emails still open, alongside 3 photographs I'd taken outside that brick house with my own phone. Her face went through stages I'll never forget, 15 years of marriage compressed into 10 seconds of watching someone's mask fall away completely. First pale, all color draining from her face like water through a cracked pipe. Then defensive, words tumbling out about work stress and feeling unappreciated and needing something for herself. And then, worst of all, something close to relief, like a woman finally allowed to stop performing a role she'd grown exhausted playing. "You'll want to talk to your lawyer about the business too," she said, voice steadier than I expected, almost businesslike. "Richard already has papers filed." I stood in our kitchen under harsh overhead light that cast no warmth on either of us, and I asked her, quietly, why. Not about Richard specifically, but why any of it, why 18 months of lies layered over 15 years of marriage. She was quiet for a long moment before answering, and what she said surprised me more than anything else that night. She told me she'd felt invisible after my father died 3 years earlier, watching me disappear into 80-hour workweeks as a way of avoiding grief I never processed properly, watching me come home increasingly distant while she raised our children largely alone, praised for her independence when really she'd just been abandoned slowly, one late night at a time. It wasn't an excuse, she said, just an explanation, and somewhere underneath my anger I recognized an uncomfortable seed of truth in it, even as it did nothing to justify 18 months of stolen money and a second life built in secret. We stood there in silence after that, the kitchen clock ticking louder than it had any right to, both of us finally seeing each other clearly for the first time in longer than either of us wanted to admit, right as everything we'd built together started falling apart for good. It turned out Richard's ambitions reached further than my marriage. Over the following weeks, through documents I'd forwarded and a forensic accountant I hired within days, I learned he'd been positioning himself to force a buyout of my engineering firm entirely, using leverage built from money he and Jenny had already funneled through Hartwell Consulting, banking on a divorce leaving me too distracted and depleted to notice the maneuvering happening around my own company. He underestimated how patience and precision, the very qualities that had built my career, would now be turned entirely against him. I spent 4 months quietly gathering documentation, working with a divorce attorney who specialized in hidden assets, tracing every wire transfer back to its source, building a case with the same discipline I'd bring to any structural report where lives depended on getting the calculations exactly right. When everything finally settled, I walked away with full ownership of my firm, Richard's investment voided through fraud clauses his own lawyers had apparently overlooked, weekday custody of Emma and her younger brother, and a settlement that accounted for every dollar Jenny had tried to hide inside that brick house she thought no one would ever find. Jenny kept the house itself, a hollow victory considering the real estate deal it was meant to fund collapsed entirely once my firm's contracts, the ones Richard needed as leverage, were legally protected and removed from his reach. Some nights I still think about that violinist, waiting outside Bella Notte for a woman who never arrived, playing quietly to an empty table while I sat across the room discovering the truth instead. I've learned that some structures, once cracked deeply enough, can't simply be patched and reinforced. They have to be dismantled entirely and rebuilt from a foundation that's actually solid, this time with materials you've tested yourself rather than trusted blindly. Standing in my newly secured office one evening months later, watching the Nashville skyline soften into dusk through the window, I finally felt something like steady ground beneath me again. Then my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. "You don't know the whole truth about Richard and Jenny. There's more. Call me." I stared at that message for a long time before deciding what to do next. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and share for more interesting stories.